Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome. My name is Marco Hernandez. I am a clinical counselor for Harmony CDC. I am a licensed professional counselor, and a little bit more about myself, which also includes ideas that will be kind of shared with you throughout this presentation regarding my background, personal experience, as well as experiences that I've had in working with other patients when it comes to culture and acculturation, which is what we're going to be talking about. I'm originally from Mexico. I lived there for about 15 years of my life. And then after that, I moved over here for about another rest of my life. So I'm here now. And with that comes a lot of changes, a lot of changes that I will be able to share with you and will, excuse me, go through in this presentation. There are going to be a lot of terms and very technical things that will be talked about, but we're going to have examples, and some of them are going to be, like I said, from my experience, and the others are going to be as well from previous cases that I've had, and just observations and previous experiences that I've had with the field. So welcome. Again, it's great to be here, and I'm hoping that you can get something out of this. I'm going to thank Harmony for hosting this and everybody on the team that made this possible. And so without further ado, let's get started. So when we talk about culture, we talk about several things. We talk about attitudes, we talk about values, we talk about goals and practices that characterize an institution or organization or a group of people. Now, specific to this presentation, we're going to talk on a continuum between individualistic and collectivistic cultures, which is what we see a lot of things come up in when it comes to acculturation. So, for example, we will bring up examples of Asian Americans that have been here either for a second generation, Mexican Americans, Latin Americans, any other country that may come here on a frequent basis to interact with the American culture, which would be their host culture, in conjunction with what they bring to the table, which would be their home culture. So those are two things that we will definitely focus on throughout this presentation. A little bit more about that. We will also do kind of look at the performance difficulties. When we adapt to a new culture, we often face challenges starting in maintaining successful careers. If you think about somebody coming into the United States without much experience with the English language, that can be a big barrier. The other thing would be legal documents that they perhaps do not have, transferable credentials, access to childcare. So those are all limitations that can cause performance difficulties in the workplace that are not necessarily going to be straightforward to answer and or address. But as you can see, and we'll see during this presentation, they do affect our ability to function in a society and really excel and be all that we are as a person in a holistic perspective rather than a fragmented perspective. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. So schools for individuals that are younger and or young adults that decide to go to college here, and or the adults that go into the career force and have difficulties there. We will also discuss mental health challenges. Acculturation is a process that is not linear. It's definitely fluid, goes back and forth. We can have setbacks, we can have moving forward, and there's a variety of different ways you can experience it. It's not going to be individual to everybody. It's going to be unique to each person. These things that happen under stress can definitely cause what we tend to call acculturation stress. And as you can imagine, with regular stress, not necessarily culture-specific stress, we have situations where the extended period of time that we exist under stress can impact us in many ways. One of them can be physically, so psychosomatic different symptoms, mental health-wise, such as anxiety and depression. And it can also cause issues with the relationships that we may have and connecting with others in the new culture. Some of the physical challenges and or challenges that come about, based on acculturation stress can manifest in physical illness. And these are very specific to different cultures. So for example, one of my experiences has been that with people coming from Latin America or Mexican American families, their symptoms are typically not necessarily what you would see in American westernized culture. They're going to be things such as somatic complaints. We can see this in Asian cultures as well, where there's a case of an individual who was experiencing a lot of pain in their stomach. And he continued to go to the doctor and try to get diagnoses for them. And every result that they had came out negative for any MELES or any type of disease or anything to that effect. Eventually, he was referred to a place where he could get some psychological evaluation. And so, lo and behold, after doing an assessment and trying to figure out what was going on, there was a lot of somatic presentation and what you expect to see in a westernized culture as potential depression or anxiety, but his was centered along somatic complaints such as stomach ache and headaches. So these challenges can be of a psychological nature, but present themselves in a somatic way. Another example of that would be the overactive and underactive cardiovascular activity. Decreased immunity. As we know, there's a strong relationship between our stress levels and the immunity that we have as individuals in our body. And that can also lead with anxiety and depression to lack of self-care. So if we're not taking care of each other, we're going to be under stress, we're going to have difficulties with our body, and it's going to start circling around and lead us to a place where we don't want to be. One of the things that I've worked with in the past and has been very beneficial to me, and I encourage anybody to have that experience, is working with the people experiencing homelessness. There's a lot to be said about the idea of acculturating and coming into a different culture and being able to excel, succeed, live a comfortable life. Sometimes because of all these stressors, all these misunderstandings, the difficulties, the barriers that we've talked about a little bit with regards to coming into a culture, you can experience a lot of distress, and a lot of people, end up in financial hardship, and some of them can end up homeless. So that's something that you see in the shelters, especially undocumented workers, and it's a very, very sad situation, but if we think about it, there's something underlying that. And I think it's important, and more to the point of this presentation, is that there are certain aspects of a person's function, a person's experience, that will lead them down certain paths that may not necessarily be directly linked, but have some influence in things such as homelessness. The other thing we will be discussing is reverse culture shock. So this occurs when individuals return to their home after a period of acculturation and find it difficult to adjust. Now, as I said earlier, I was in Mexico for about 15 years. I came over here and I stayed here for about maybe 5 years before I went back. And when I went back, my mentality was to find everything the same, to find everything as it was. Unfortunately, time, adaptations, growth, and everything keeps going, even though you stop living in a place where you used to be. And so going back, it's going to be a different experience. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to adjust and interact with others. As we go through the process of acculturation, when we're going from marginalization to integration, which we'll discuss in a little bit, we tend to adopt different behaviors, different mentalities, different features, different ways of viewing things. And so going back to a culture that you used to know, which is your home culture, can cause the culture shock that we talk about in some instances. And that can be very distressing and can cause certain problems and exacerbate mental health issues as well. Acculturation gaps in family conflict. So when it comes to first generation, second generation populations that come to the United States, there is a lot of stress involved in the gap related to family, and specifically related to different the gaps in the parents versus the children. When the children come in and they are first generation or second generation, and they start to adapt to the culture. And as such, do it faster than the adults that have had a longer time to adjust to their home culture. There seems to be a discrepancy in between what they experience and what the parents experience. Different points of view, different points of connection, different points of perspective when it comes to living in a different society, and so those can clash together, as you can probably imagine. My values are very different from my child's. They don't understand why I'm trying to discipline. They're very independent. They want to do whatever they want. And so a lot of times we may confuse that, especially in the context of culture, as something that is more behavioral, when in reality, it's just a difference in our level of acculturation when it comes to understanding the dynamics that happen between one person and another. We will also discuss substance use or substance misuse. Now, one interesting point about substance use is that the acculturation process, the more acculturated you become, the more likely you are to engage in substance use, which is very counterintuitive if you think about it. At least for me, that's kind of what it appeared to be. At first, if I think about somebody integrating into a society, what I think about is their adaptability, their resilience, their strength, and everything that comes with it and interacting with another culture. However, that doesn't seem to be what research indicates. What research indicates is that the more acculturated you become, the more integrated you become into this Americanized community, the more likely you are to be able to engage in substance use and misuse. Now, that's something completely separate, can take us a long time to discuss. So I will leave it at that, but that's just something important to consider and really reflect on when we talk about culture and acculturation. These problems can be addressed through many different approaches. One of them would be, definitely psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, supportive therapy, person-centered therapy. And it's important to note that the process of acculturation and the associated challenges can vary greatly between individuals, and not everyone is going to experience the problems the same way or to the same extent. Getting started with the introduction to culture. So by culture, we define it as a set of attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or organization, as we mentioned before. There's a continuum between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. When we talked about the differences between a home culture and the host culture, which in this case would be the United States, there's a difference typically that we see in collectivistic versus individualistic. And we're not saying here that one is always going to be one way and the other is going to be the other. We're just saying there's a continuum here in which we lie in various degrees at various points of acculturation. So the collectivistic culture is going to be more interdependent, more harmonious, interacting between people. Conformity is going to be important. Reciprocity is going to be important. I recently went to a presentation here on Hispanic Heritage Month, and one of the things that was very interesting to me is that, and it's very true, I never thought of it this way, but point out the idea that when it comes to asking somebody how they are, here in the United States, you say, "How are you doing?" Very personalized question. When you ask somebody in a different language, let's just say in Spanish, you say, "How are we doing?" That was something that I've known my whole life, and it just kind of took for granted, but it's very important in the distinction between collectivistic and individualistic cultures and how we represent, how we go about sharing our attitudes, beliefs, values, and goals, and become interdependent and harmonious and conform to different reciprocity rules. The difference there is with individualistic cultures, we're more independent. We have more autonomy. We're more assertive. And personal achievement is very, very high up there when it comes to trying to understand an individualistic culture and adopt to that. So as you can see, these are almost in direct opposition with each other. However, there is a way to manage to get to integration, which is the ultimate goal of becoming acculturated. So we will get to that point in a minute, and we'll see kind of the struggles that may happen during this process of change. So the process of acculturation happens when we start to shift or adopt or reject certain cultural norms. And this can be seen as acculturation stress. So we don't necessarily have to adjust to the culture. We can stay stagnant. We can stay in one place. There are many, many instances where I've worked with clients from different cultures where they need an interpreter for purposes of understanding what it is they're going through. And the significance of that is that sometimes we tend to reject the host culture and find a way to completely embrace our home culture, so that we don't have to change and acculturate to the society that's mainstream, in this case, the American society. Now, as you can imagine, that can cause some problems because we're trying to adapt to something that we do not embrace. So there's going to be a disconnect. There's going to be a lack of connection with other people, especially in, things such as workforce, school, family, society, maybe even institutional barriers that may be there. Some of the things that can happen are depression, lack of self-worth, anxiety, and one of the very uh, everything is serious, but everything doesn't have to lead to suicidal ideation, which happens at times, and that's in a very worst case scenario. Now, as you can see in this acculturation and mental health model, we have what's called the acculturation model, and it's a dual process where we see the Johari window and the different stages of acculturation. We've talked a little bit about what happens in different stages. So if we look at the top right, where we are not maintaining native culture and we are embracing the host culture, we become assimilated. This occurs when an individual adopts the cultural norms of a dominant or host culture over their original culture. So what we see here, and an example of that would be a shift between wanting to embrace our own culture and completely embracing the other without integrating both of them. That, as you can probably tell, is something that may cause some conflict in the identity, socially speaking, of a person. If I see somebody that is perhaps from a different country, and they come and they interact with people who are from the same home country, but have adopted or have not adopted to the American society, then there exists a little bit of a disconnect between these two people with regards to their acculturation. Some may see them as maybe not as quote unquote Mexican, quote unquote Greek, quote unquote Asian, because there's this process of assimilation and this process of trying to understand what it is that I am within this culture. And so when we shift these ways in assimilation, it's going to look a lot like we're almost leaving things behind, when in reality, it's just part of the process of us trying to understand and make sense of what it is that we're coming to become in this culture. Now, if you look at the bottom left, separation occurs when the individuals reject the dominant culture or host culture in favoring the presenting culture of the origin. It's often facilitated by immigration to ethnic enclaves. Marginalization, bottom right, occurs when individuals reject both their culture of origin and the dominant host culture. So you can imagine, if I am a person that comes from a different country and I'm trying to understand this new culture, but somehow or another I reached a point where I do not either embrace my host culture or my home culture, there seems to be a loss of identity there, a loss of cultural identity. And so read into that what you may see things such as increased loss of interest in activities that you may have had pleasure in, decreased social interactions with others, decreased familial interactions with each other. And so all of these things can cause what you would consider and could equate to symptoms of depression. However, if you're in a clinical setting and you're looking at these situations, they can mimic each other in the same way that you are viewing one and the other. And addressing the problem is going to be a matter of discerning what it is that's really going on. Is one before the other, or is the other before the depression? So the interaction between those two things can be very difficult to discern, but it's important to keep this in mind when we're working with other people, because that's going to be key to trying to understand their dynamics and inner workings and understanding of the world, and help them get out of this run of marginalization where they feel without an identity, may feel lack of self-worth, anxiety, depression, and all these things that come with it. The top left, which is integration, is the ideal place where you want to be. This is, so to speak, the healthiest part of becoming acculturated. And so this occurs when the individuals are able to adopt the cultural norms of the dominant culture, the host culture, and maintain their culture of origin. So this integration is often equated to biculturalism. So there's a very big difference, and I want to make sure I emphasize this, is there's a very big difference between what it is to be bilingual and what it is to be bicultural. They're not the same thing in my understanding of the words. One can be completely bilingual, but not have the assimilation to the culture or integration of a culture that is the host culture. That's going to make a big difference in understanding other people. If we don't understand the culture itself, we can have the most eloquent verbiage that we can imagine and still not have that connection with others. So that would still fall under the assimilation as opposed to the integration. So I'm hoping that makes sense. So integration, the ideal outcome, we see that in places such as when we speak Spanglish, just as an example. We've integrated both the dynamics of language and culture into a separate way of communicating. So we see that in play with either Mexican Americans or even in Asian cultures and cultures that come from all over the world. You start to see these differences. One of the surprising things to me, and one of the difficult things for me to really adjust to, was when struggling with these two identities of the host culture and the home culture, in this case the Mexican and American culture, was that there is a blend, there is an integration point. And fortunately, to my benefit, I was put in a situation where I was able to embrace this. In this case, it was Texas, very close to the border. You see a lot of people coming from South America and Central America and Mexico, and so they blend in with what is considered the northern part of the culture and become a completely different culture, which is the Tex-Mex, Texan. Southern Texan kind of way of thinking. And so fortunately for me, it was a way to kind of adopt things without having to completely disintegrate from one and go into another and then go back and forth. There was part of that was happening, but it made it a lot easier for me to be able to adjust to these different cultures, different norms, expectations, ways of being, understanding, and even interacting with my family. So when it comes to the different generation gaps, there's a difference in acculturation levels there. And so if we see those as something that is a hindrance to us, it's going to be a lot harder than it would be if we didn't have that connection to society. In this case, the Texan culture, for my specific example, than it would be without it. Now, what are some of the cultural factors influencing mental health outcomes? We talked about acculturation stress. We talked about a little bit about depression. The statistic is significant in that immigrants may experience higher rates of depressive symptoms due to the challenges navigating between two different cultures and the pressure to succeed. We see this a lot in Asian cultures. So just as an example, I've worked with a lot of Asian individuals who are very depressed, come to the clinic saying they don't know how to manage that or have high levels of anxiety. And so what we see is that in their culture, achievement in the academic setting is very, very high. That expectation is extremely high. It happens also in Indian culture, where the expectation is that you get as high education as you can because you want to be successful. Now, I've spoken before with people from India that say that the competition in achieving higher education is fierce. You can see that here, but not as predominantly as you would see it in other countries because of the availability for it to be something that can integrate to their person there. It's available. It's something that they embrace and as a culture is highly valued. Now, shift that and let's go to a different place of the world where maybe perhaps education is not the most valued thing. Maybe the most valued thing is to work. Economic situations may arise where the kids, either 10, maybe younger, have to work to help the family survive. That's a very different expectation. So in those two examples, coming into a dominant culture where you are expected to succeed in those ways, but the culture does not match that, it can cause, again, a discrepancy in between what you feel and what's experienced. So this can lead to things like depression, anxiety, the acculturation conflict, the pressure to adapt to new culture, especially for people who have children of immigrants. Now, with that comes another plethora of different issues. One of them that we see often is post-traumatic stress disorder. So children of immigrants, particularly refugees, have experienced traumatic events before, during, and perhaps even after the experience of migration, which can lead to PTSD. So that's very, as you can see, there's a parallel in what we see that's a response to cultural stress and what would be considered, traditional, straightforward clinical presentations of mental disorders. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes we can confuse behavioral problems with what it appears to be as somebody being defiant, what it appears to be somebody that's not wanting to adjust to the expectations of either elder generation or even their institutional rules and regulations. We can equate that to behavioral problems from one perspective, but we can also equate them to the immigrant children that have higher risk of behavioral problems, such as conduct disorder and substance use disorder. And this is a function of, like we mentioned earlier, the integration into the mainstream society. It tends to increase while we become integrated into the process of American culture. Now, children of immigrants may experience higher levels of psychological distress, including feelings of nervousness, hopelessness, restlessness, worthlessness, compared to the first generation immigrant parents. And again, we're talking about this distress that's caused by the generational gap in cultural differences. Physical symptoms such as headache, fatigue, gastrointestinal issues, those are all things that are somatic, but also have their representation in psychological underpinnings as opposed to physical ailments per se. And as we mentioned before, the greater the acculturation, the more likely it is that somebody will become using of substances. Now, if we look at the cultural differences between the collectivistic and individualistic culture, there may be a lot of room to grow when it comes to embracing a culture. And by that, I mean, if we try to compare one and the other, we're doing ourselves a disservice when it is the best case scenario to integrate both. Now, we may feel some guilt when we transfer in these two areas. We may feel some reason to feel guilty about embracing certain things about an ex culture or a new culture. And that's going to lead to some problems. And as you can see, that can trickle down into how it exacerbates stress and or mental health. Do we feel competent in our culture? Do we feel like we are excelling? As we mentioned before, it's valued very much that independence, high success, high achievement, autonomy. And if I don't feel competent in my culture while I'm integrating, or even after I've been here for quite a while, it's going to cause a lot of distress. It's going to cause a lot of different things to come up within me that may shake my identity to the core and not necessarily allow me to move forward. Along with the PTSD that you experience and the different either forms of racism or institutional racism or whatever it is that you may call discrimination and prejudice, you're going to find that in different ways and in different forms, and it may affect people differently. But it's very important to keep this in mind, because that can, just like with a person that's going through a traumatic episode and relives it over and over, the discrimination and prejudice that comes with coming from a different culture can have the same effect. And so we need to make sure we understand those differences there so that we can assist a person when it comes to moving forward in their journey of acculturation. We've already talked about acculturation gap quite a bit. And so we're going to move on to the cultural factors, coping mechanisms that are typically seen to help in this process. So it's very important to keep in mind that however much we integrate into the American society, it's also important to embrace what we used to know and learn without feeling that guilt of betraying our culture or not being fully belonging to one or the other. I'm going to go back to an example again to a presentation we had on the American heritage culture. Our director, Claudia from Harmony, pointed this out, and after reflecting on it, it was very, very telling, very interesting, and it describes a very real concern, a real problem in perception or an understanding of what it is to be a Mexican American. And I can speak to that because I am a Mexican American. So the movie Selena, right? What was it? You have to be more Mexican than the Mexicans, and you have to be more American than the Americans. Wow. What does that mean? Well, that means you're definitely going to be stretched in either direction, the furthest possible extent you can. While in this process of acculturation, you're trying to integrate. That seems very counterintuitive, but in our identity and in order to survive in certain instances, we have to do this. We have to feel like we're competent. We have to feel like our traditions are valued. And so we can become a person that goes back and forth between these two. Now, embracing our cultural traditions and family bonds are going to increase the likelihood that we cope better with these. But it's also a society issue where we're expected to be, in certain areas, very, very, in this case, Mexican, and on the other hand, very, very Americanized. Otherwise, we can see instances where you're not taken seriously, you're prejudiced against, you're discriminated against, and things like that start to happen. Now, some of the acculturation strategies are going to have to do a lot with being able to allow the feeling of integration to happen while allowing the process to continue whatever level you are. So if I'm in a marginalized state, it's very likely that I feel like there's no hope. We talked about hopelessness, like there's nothing to live for, like there's nothing to look forward to. And I am in constant dissonance between these two things because there's no clear picture of what I am. So understanding that there's a process, just like in grief, we go through processes and they're not linear. They're fluid and they can change from time to time, and they're going to be different in levels of intensity from person to person. But if we understand that we're going through this process and it's normal, then it can take the stress off of us when it comes to trying to figure out whether or not this is where I'm supposed to be or not. Now, mindfulness and relaxation techniques, as we talked a lot about, the presentation of different cultures and symptoms is sometimes somatic. And so as you probably know, mindfulness is very here and now, paying attention to what's happening in your body, paying attention to what's the present moment. And relaxation techniques such as progressive muscle relaxation, breathing techniques, and or doing other activities that may cause relaxation specific to the individual. Those are going to be coping mechanisms that can assist in the process of us experiencing anxiety, becoming more self-aware of what it is that I'm experiencing, as opposed to just brushing it off as being anxiety or depression. Fortunately, there is help out there, seeking help with schools, community resources. So, as you know, we're here with Harmony. That's a resource we use, and such a privilege to be able to help others from this perspective in a culturally diverse program. It's difficult to find. Somebody mentioned one of the therapists being a unicorn, and I thought that was interesting because the further you get into competency, the less you see people in excess amount. By that I mean is if you want to find somebody that's a therapist, that lowers the pick of the crop. If you want to find a therapist that's bilingual, that narrows it even more. If you want to find a therapist that's bicultural and bilingual, well, then you have a little bit more specifics to deal with. And so the further down the line you go, the more it's going to be difficult to find those resources. However, there are resources out there, and I guess that's part of the education in this instance, is that there are people that understand the different cultures and want to help in that capacity. And so resources that we reach out to, we need to be sure that they're going to be competent in this area so that we can achieve the best outcome possible when it comes to acculturating into a new culture. Now, peer support is going to be very important. If we think about the connections we have in our host culture, in this case, in a collectivistic culture, versus the ones that we have in an individualistic culture, by default, we are already disconnected. But there's a way to increase that feeling of connectedness, wholeness, harmony, reciprocity that we spoke about earlier. And that's the way to do that is by including yourself in peer support. So engaging in activities that may not necessarily be completely what your culture at home was, but something that's similar or that integrates that as well is going to cause a lot of different shifts in how you perceive things, maybe the belongingness, decreased in anxiety, decreased in depression, and their feelings of hopelessness. Now, the reason mental health care is there is because I think it's important to make a difference and discern what it is that's causing something at the core in order to call it something like a mental health issue versus an acculturation a process that you're going through. Now, it's not to say that if you were acculturating, you're not going to become depressed, because we already established that that's probably something that you can experience. But there's also, depression that comes from other things, such as not psychological factors, more organic, perhaps. And they're not mutually exclusive, but they do interact with each other. So it's just important to make the distinction between those two things. And again, we're talking from a point of view of the treatment and the care that you receive from mental health professionals when it comes to really discerning those differences and what it is that you want to achieve and goals that you need to get to and what care you're going to receive. Now, we talked about strategies, we talked about relaxation techniques, and we talked about community resources and mental health care. There's a lot being thrown at you at this moment. Some of the cultural traditionals and family bonds, children need to experience strength, need to experience cultural bonds, familial bonds, to become integrated and have a sense of belonging and identity. we opt. There are three types of acculturation. There's consonant acculturation, which is when children and parents adapt to the new culture at the same pace. Dissonant acculturation, when it's the children assimilate faster than the parents. And selective acculturation, which involves maintaining aspects of the original culture while adopting elements of the new culture, which can preserve parental authority and reduce intergenerational conflict. This is for the parents out there. A lot of the troubles that I've seen in integrating cultures is that there's a discrepancy between what I perceive as what should be happening versus what is actually happening in my child's perspective of life and or world, so to speak. And those can be in conflict, and those can cause a lot of stress in the family. So when you talk about going to family therapy or going to get assistance in, this is a behavioral problem. My child just constantly goes off the deep end and doesn't listen to me and does this and does that. The distinction between those two things does not necessarily have to be one-sided. It can also be a function of the dynamics that you interact with when it comes to different acculturation levels. Now, I know that's a lot of information. I want to make sure that I allow for some Q&A. And so at this point in time, I would like to turn it over to you guys and see if you guys have any questions whatsoever and or comments about this presentation and whether or not there's something else that you would like to hear about. So I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this important issue of acculturation. And we're here to help. We're available. I think there's going to be some information for you on the chat as well. And you're more than welcome to access that. The phone number is there. We're able to assist you. And please keep in mind that your mental health is important and you're important as well. Thank you very much.